active on the internet, that they're making more choices and they're pursuing things, and it can be okay for people. I think a lot of social media is not that great for people. I mean, I think there's been quite a bit of research now on Facebook and how Facebook ends up with people feeling bad about themselves because people are kind of posting these false profiles of themselves, saying that they're doing things and all the rest of it. And that can then have quite a negative effect on other people because they think that they're missing out. But actually, it's a bit of a lie a lot of the time on Facebook. If you were really having that life, you probably wouldn't be sitting posting it on Facebook. So I think that kind of thing. But I actually think Facebook is a bit of a fad, and I think people will move away from it. I don't think it's going to keep having the kind of profile that it has.
Kids are moving away from Facebook because the parents.
Yeah, absolutely. The parents are on it as well. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Would you like me to come next? I've no idea. No, I don't know. That would be good at spotting that kind of trend. I really don't know. I'm not sure.
Because I don't think the young people watch TV as much. I think they're on the social media thing.
Well, I think that recently it came out saying that young people are still watching television more than people think, but they're doing it at the same time. It's kind of on, and they're doing Facebook or whatever at the same time, playing games, but the telly is kind of still on.
Do you think their brains have evolved to multitask? Something like that, because I would say that they seem to cope.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could well be. I think that they will have slightly different brains from that point of view.
You could term it multi-absorb, as opposed to multitask. It's not really doing anything, they're just sitting,
Absorbing.
absorbing different mediums.
Trying to my brain crazy.
Yeah.
I don't think you have a difficult sell with this, Carol. I mean, in terms of government and corporations, they like to control us as an audience and as a constituent, if you like.
I think on the other hand, and I was talking to someone who's a kind of expert in marketing recently, and he was saying this, actually the whole thing is really quite fragile because people can just stop buying as much. It's not really that difficult a choice, and in fact, you do think some of the times people are doing that, that it is that people are making some kind of conscious choice to kind of restrict their consumption, but it's then seen as a major problem. And there's no doubt it would be a major problem because our whole economic system is based on consumption. But I don't know. I think we need to start doing something differently. I mean, apart from that, I didn't even cover the environmental issues. We're acting as if constant economic growth is feasible on a finite planet. It's not. We're going to have to curb or restrain this at some point, or we really are going to run out of space or resources or whatever. There's a major issue about this. And I think that maybe there is more of an awareness because of the flooding, that we're maybe into that world where it is going to start having an impact on us. But I think if you think of it in terms of resources, I think people can see we cannot keep consuming the world's resources in this kind of way to update mobile phones, television or whatever with features that you often don't even use. So I think it's a hard sell in some ways and yet an easy sell in others, because I think instinctively a lot of people appreciate that there is something very empty about this kind of way of living. I think people are searching for something.
Is there a certain age group where people, the talks you give, have you been aware that it's a certain age of people taking interest in that? Some would realise themselves that maybe there's something missing, or is it across the board?
I think it's really much across the board. I mean, I've actually given some talks to young people, and a lot of them, I think we did have young people, and I think maybe they've gone. It would have been quite good to have got some feedback from them. But I think quite often they are aware that there's something not right. There's something intrinsically not right about this. and no one's really talking about it. So sometimes it can be a sense of relief. I've had a few emails from young men actually saying, I felt like this for a while and I'm just so glad that you're saying something about it.
I found it very interesting when you were talking about the service part, because I work in schools, and as part of the DRE award where they do a service,
Yeah,
a lot of young people, I work with vulnerable young people,
yeah,
that service part, and they're so nervous to do it, to start off with, but once they've had the experience, so we should be doing it in schools every year. Kids should be going out to do a week of service somewhere, first year, second year, third year, fourth year.
absolutely, absolutely.
What a difference that would make.
Yes, yes, yes.
And then they're learning, because a lot of them were very scared, because it's something that they weren't sure what they were going to be asked to do, but once they get into the hang of it.
Yeah. And it becomes about the thing you're doing rather than that continual reflection back to yourself. Yes. No, I agree with you.
Carol, I was just wanting to understand a little bit more about this thing that you were saying right at the beginning, that the economic treadmill and the fact that we are maybe inherently competitive, and partly from a kind of survival point of view, but also possibly because we actually enjoy being competitive. And in listening to all the things you say, and I know that you weren't saying this, but there's a way in which you can slightly interpret it in terms of saying, well, if it was all about sunshine and cows, it will be perfectly happy again, and return to a simple life. Whereas I think there is something in us which actually likes to be competitive. You get a buzz out of it, and there's actual happiness that comes from that. So those things that you sort of see as the roots of evil in some way, actually are also the things that sit very closely to what makes us alive as human beings.
It's interesting, there's a woman called Jennifer Crocker, who's an American psychologist, who talks about this, and I think it's quite interesting, that there's been various researchers that kind of suggest that there's two motivational systems for human beings. One of them is the kind of survival one, which can be quite competitive, and it's about getting ahead of other people and making sure, looking out for number one and all the rest of it. But there's another, if that's what we were like as human beings, we wouldn't survive. We just wouldn't survive as a species, because we wouldn't bring up our children, we wouldn't cooperate to bring up children. And actually, cooperate over food and build communities and all the rest of it, which human beings have. So there is another motivational system, which is the tend and befriend and the nurturing system. And some people talk about it as the ego system and the ecosystem, right? So one of them is about me, one of them is about community. And what they're saying, and they've looked at and studied this in people, this Jennifer Crocker, and she's arguing that both men and women have access to both motivational systems, and that we make a moment-by-moment choice as to which one we're going to pay attention to. And my argument would be, we are encouraged so much to pay attention to the competitive, being better, achieving, proving your worth over other people, one, and not encouraged quite as much anymore to pay attention to the tend and befriend. So I think you're right, I think it's there, and I think people can get an incredible buzz out of achievement and success and so on. And I'm not opposed to that. I just don't like it being seen as all about what human beings are about. I think that it's more complicated than that.
Sorry, see, before we go, can we get you on the microphone so I can pick up the questions a bit more clearly for the camera?
Just following on from that, do you think there's a problem with language? And because we have one word meant to do a lot of work in happiness. So you have, say, people who live in an icy landscape and they have so many words for snow. So saying that you said about importing our values, a lot of values from America, and America has life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in its constitution.
Absolutely.
And does it mean happiness, or is it something like satisfaction of desire? there might be very different things, and I think perhaps slightly what the gentleman over there is talking about. You have a desire for something, you want it, you go out there, you get it, you get a kick, you get a satisfaction. It's not necessarily the same thing. There could be I think there is a whole landscape of subtlety and nuance that just gets missed. And one of the reasons it's so difficult to challenge is because people struggle to actually talk about the same thing. Like you were saying, people know this stuff, and they do, but then it's all covered over by other things. And so people are searching for something that they already have and that they already know, and they're going after other things. So yeah, it was about language.
Yeah,
and
no,
a big ramble.
I think it's a very complicated topic, and even to try and make the distinction between happiness and well-being. I mean, as a centre, I run a centre called the Centre for Confidence and Wellbeing. We haven't gone down the happiness route. We've never particularly liked the word happiness because it's very much about kind of pleasure in the moment, and I think that is actually part of the problem for people. We're living in quite a hedonistic age. I don't know that we want to encourage people to do more of that. I think often, the satisfaction is got from deferred gratification. But I think there's a bigger issue, which is that I think that people are often searching outside of themselves for something, and there's a void inside. And that Eastern cultures with kind of Buddhism or mindfulness or meditation are better at encouraging people to fill that void. And I'm pleased that there's more emphasis now on mindfulness. You're aware of mindfulness, aren't you? Because I think that is more likely to kind of fill that void for people. And I think given the fact that there is this overconsumption going on for people to try and get satisfaction in life, we've got to move away from that. It's got to become more of an internal state of satisfaction that you're learning to create.
If you feel like you're alive inside,
Yes.
because that could be good or bad or a million different things, but at least you're alive. Whereas if you feel like it's not your life and you're being driven by forces beyond your control, it's a very unpleasant situation. Whereas if you're alive inside and it's still a terrible situation, at least it's your life.
Yeah, absolutely.
We were saying about changing and not being so much of a consumer. I've just exercised that tonight in going to the bookstall and wanting to buy 2 of the books of yours that I don't have, and deciding, well, I would only buy one. Because I've got more books in my house. If I lived for 20 years and read every day, I probably wouldn't read them. I really have appreciated what you've been saying and how you've taken so many aspects of things and condensed them and spoken about them in a way that certainly I have found is easy to understand and is very meaningful. But I'd like to challenge you on a couple of things. I sort of wrote them down so I wouldn't forget. One of them was about Facebook. My brother was saying that I would suffer if there was an end to Facebook. But thank you. But for me, there is something. It does point out. It's not all trivial. For example, things come to my mind about people that I know who are mindful and are concerned about the issues that have been raised tonight. So, for example, there's a picture of a young African boy trying to get water out of this muddy puddle, and the caption is, "And you are looking to get the next iPhone 5 or whatever." And it really draws it to your attention, and things about the rainforest and the damage, the destruction that's being done. And there's something about that wee caption, the photograph and the caption. It's not taking a lot of time, but it gets it across. And it also, I feel really connected, living now as I do back in Ayrshire, to people in different parts of the world, not just the country, and having that sense of connectedness and of shared values that I do value. The other thing is your U-curve of happiness, and how people at the older age group, which would include me, and the people in the younger age group. But I'm not good at remembering statistics and figures, but I do believe that the suicide rate in young men is very high. It's one of the common causes of death in young men in Scotland. So where does that fit in? I know it's complex, I know it's not simple or straightforward. But
let me deal with the last one first. I mean, it's true. I mean, the suicide rate in Scotland is quite high. It's higher. I mean, it's not as high as it is in some of the Scandinavian countries, but they have very high happiness rates. You see, so it doesn't mean that within a society with high happiness rates, you won't get individuals who are feeling suicidal. I mean, you can get that, but it's obviously not enough to kind of dent those figures, if you see what I mean. I mean, sometimes they just coexist. People can score quite high in happiness one day, and yet, you know, a few weeks later they can feel suicidal. I mean, it's not common, but it can happen. But I mean, anyway, the U-shape for happiness is kind of well established, and some people are saying actually it's well established in certain countries. But if you look at some third world countries, older people are treated so badly and it can be so poor that they are not happy, and it is one of the achievements of Western culture that we are actually producing, you know, older people that actually have reasonable standard of living and actually the wherewithal to live a good life, and that is a kind of positive thing. But on Facebook and social media, I agree with you, and I'm not trying to blacken it all. I'm very aware. You know, I run an organisation that couldn't exist if it weren't for the internet. I mean, I've often thought about that. You know, I can remember working in an office years ago where it was gestekners and duplicators and everything had to go in envelopes. And if you think about the labour that required, you know, whereas we've got a database of about 5,000 people, and you just press a button and it goes out. You know, we just couldn't. We're so small, we couldn't operate otherwise. So there's a lot of very positive things about technology. There's a way of spreading ideas, of organising. All of that is incredibly important. I think there is an issue, however, about Facebook for young people in particular. I mean, maybe it's becoming less so because a lot of them are drifting off it anyway. Because, and I've heard young people saying this, something like the like button is really cruel. You know, that you post something about yourself and no one says anything, no one likes it, or you get really quite nasty comments. Although recently I read that some of the nasty bullying comments were actually posted by the young people themselves. Self-trolling, it's called.
Like self-harming?
Yeah, it's a similar kind of phenomenon. So I just, you know, again, with a lot of this, I'm a great believer in balance and moderation. And, you know, a wee bit doing that's fine. And I think Facebook can be great for keeping families together. And if your families in New Zealand, it's really good. You can find out what they're doing and see photographs. And, you know, there's a lot of positive uses of it. But I think there's quite a lot of negative uses as well. And, you know, partly on the internet, I think there's a huge issue of pornography. Absolutely massive issue of pornography that isn't discussed enough. So I think it is about balance.
Just taking you back to your earlier point about economic growth. A job gives certainly a man a sense of purpose. Mm-hmm. If we don't have economic growth, we don't have job creation. How do we give people that sense of purpose?
I mean, I'm not saying that any of this is easy. I don't think it is. And I think that it would be good if we could channel more growth activities into things that were environmental and sustainable, and energy conservation, insulation of houses. I think there's all sorts of things of that kind that could be beneficial. But there are some real quandaries about this. It's really important for people to work. It's a fundamental thing for, it comes out in happiness statistics I quoted, that people who are unemployed are much less happy than people who are employed, people who are employed are much happier than unemployed people. But we've got some real paradoxes. We've got people working very long hours, for example, where you kind of feel they should be working less, and there's people who would like more hours. There's a kind of total inequity in the system. But the system's not designed for people, and I suppose what you would want is what the New Economics Foundation talks about in kind of having an economy as if people mattered. That's what we need to move more towards. I'm not saying it's easy and I've got the answers to that, I don't know, but I think we need to start saying what we're doing at the moment is destroying the planet and actually isn't generating a great deal of satisfaction for people. How do you feel about the 4-day week? Yes, I think something like the 4-day week would be wonderful. People just working less if they wanted to. But I think, it's interesting that 20 or 30 years ago we were talking about the leisure of society, and, we're even less leisure now than we were before. It's gone in the opposite direction, hasn't it?
You mentioned earlier about exercise and happiness. Do you see a connection with the change in our diets to being far cheaper, less nutritionally sound, having an impact on people's happiness? Because I can never understand why people spend so little now on food, because more of their income spent on pleasure activities which are short-lived, rather than being a bit more for better quality.
Yeah, no, I think that there will be an issue for people. I mean, I've thought about that quite a lot recently, because there's been a lot about food banks, and what is it that, I think that there is an issue about a lot of people being underpaid and pay being eroded, and food prices are going up, and I think there is a cost of living crisis. I'm not disputing that at all. But I'm sure that there is also some people that would spend money on a mobile phone and Sky Television or whatever before they would spend money on food. That these things are more important. And again, in our society, that makes sense. Anthropologists talk about it as display, that it's more important to put a display on to people, because that's about saying I'm part of this society and I should be respected. Whereas, what you're eating is not really the same in that respect. So I think people are just probably paying attention to the values of our society. But these values are not conducive to people's well-being. That wouldn't be as true in France or other European countries where there's more emphasis on eating better food. But I think in Britain it's not particularly valued. So I think you're right.
Do you think the influence of the TV chefs has been a good thing, or
I don't know. I think one of the ironies is apparently there's never been more cooking programs, and yet less people cooking. I mean, it's
for years
watching it and not doing it. I think it's strange, isn't it?
Karen, do you think our values will always be dictated?
Dictated by the media
or government or politics?
what would it take for people to?
I think it has to be a bottom-up shift. I really don't think it can come from politicians, and I'm not criticising them in particular for this. I think that it's very difficult for them to say to people, you shouldn't be wanting this. I think the media would hound politicians if they talked about some of the things that I said here tonight. I actually spoke to quite a senior politician about this a couple of days ago. And he just said, your hands tied. You know, if I went in and said the kind of things you're saying in your book, I'd get crucified for it. And I think that's true. I really do think it's true. So I think it has to come from people themselves. I think we've got to start saying, we're looking for something different. And there's a lot of people, I mean, one of the things I end my book by saying is there was quite a big study done in the UK about 10 years ago that was asking people if they had made some kind of shift in their life that meant that they gave up money for something else. So it could be that they deliberately went on a 4-day week, they went to college or whatever. And it was something like 25% of the adult population from the age of 30 to 55 who had done something that was essentially a downshift. And that was really quite significant. And that's people doing it with no encouragement whatsoever, or very little encouragement. So people are doing it. And I think the issue is we're not hearing about that enough. I mean, one of the books that we've got in the series that I'm editing called Postcards from Scotland, and my book Materialism is number 2 in that. But one of the things that I was really aware of is there's a lot of fantastic things happening in Scotland. Not just Scotland, England and other places as well. But because of the media's collapse to some extent, there's not as many newspapers, they're much less resourced than they used to be. Unless you're living in one of these communities, you often don't know about what's happening. And so what I was very keen on is that we had a book on some of the great community projects, and I thought, how am I going to get that done? Because I've got no money, there's absolutely no money in small book publishing. And then I thought, wait a minute, I'm living with a semi-retired journalist who's very good at that kind of writing, and our son is working in Ullapool for a development trust. That's his kind of job. And so I said to them, will you write this up? And they did it as a journey, and they went to 15 projects over the course of 8 days, and Alf mainly wrote it up. It's a nice story, it's a nice journey. And it's got lots of inspirational stories of communities that are doing things for themselves. And it's like the seeds of the new society are already here. They are already there. If we could only just find out about them more and realise that without the politicians doing an awful lot, there are things that we can do. And I'm really pleased to say that's the book that's selling most. It's in its 2nd edition, whereas the other slightly more critical ones are languishing. Not quite languishing, but they're not doing as well, because that's inspiring people.
I think that the connection between the communities is really fundamental. I noticed that even in the Ayrshire groups and the lyrics of in the early stages that a lot of us are at, you know, there's a lot of strength in meeting each other and sharing stories, and so to the good.
You think we'll ever move into post-consumerism? It's very interesting to hear what you're saying, but my abiding memory in 1989 was when the wall came down. There's 2 young East German nurses passing from the Czechoslovakia into West Germany. And as the train slowed down, they crossed into the West. And a microphone was pushed in between them. And the journalist said, what do you think, what do you feel? And they said, we felt very happy because now we can get a car. Had we stayed in the East, I would have to have waited at least 5 years. And I think it's quite easy to be critical. And it's almost at the stage where when these people don't have that, it's a wee bit like men with sex. When men are complaining of sex, they don't think it's terribly important. When men are not getting sex, it becomes very important. And I think hopefully we'll maybe move to a situation where we will get to a post-consumer society. Maybe in a generation's time we'll look back and think how crass we've been.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting, and that's what the research says, that people who grew up with quite a deprived background and didn't get very much are much more materialistic than people who grew up in more kind of And that's why people who don't have money tend to be very, very materialistic. And this actually isn't about how much you've got or how much money you've got. It's to what extent you care about it. You know, there are people without very much, but they'd sell their granny if they could. Whereas there's other people that actually they've just been quite fortunate in life. That, you know, maybe they had skills and they could get a good job that paid well, but they haven't really made that the centre of their life. Do you see what I mean? So there is a difference between the two. So there is an issue there, and you're right about that. You can see how Eastern European, or my parents' generation, were thought of to be quite materialistic because they grew up with a lot of deprivation and the war and rationing and so on. And my parents were always saying life was sweet, and it was partly because they had money and they could go to the shops, they could buy things. You could see for them that was really important. And I write a bit about this in my book. On the other hand, my mother's generation were not damaged in the same way that I think the younger generation are by materialism and by the whole kind of emphasis on success and getting on. I spoke a few years ago at the head teachers for fee-paying girls' schools. And basically they said, you can't believe how successful a lot of these girls are. You know, they've got their Duke of Edinburgh Gold Award early, they're getting 3 or 4 A's at A, they're doing, you know, track and field events, you name it, they're doing it. It's not a pretty sight. These girls are anorexic, they're having nervous breakdowns, they have terrible mental health, they worried about them being really poor mothers. And I think some of that is about exposure to the media and glamorous images of thin women and so on. But I think some of it is just, there's a limit to how much individuals can bear without imploding. I think we are not made to only think about ourselves and our own achievements. I really think that that becomes turned in yourself. These girls are perfectionists. They can't cope with failure. You know, if they get an A, why don't they get an A plus? That's the problem. What they need is to think about other people. So, you know, I think it's quite complicated. Will we ever to get to a post-consumer society? I don't know. I think the issue for us, and I was saying this to you earlier on, there's nothing new in what I'm saying. Look at the Bible and, you know, all that stuff about the golden calf and, you know, materialism and, you know, these kind of mammon and all that. That's what that was about. But it was held in check to some extent because people didn't have the money. There was religion. There was socialism. You were told that these weren't great values. All of that's gone. And so that bit of ourselves that likes novelty and stuff and so on, it's got free rein. And it's not good for us.
So you think that ultimately it's a growing up stage and we have to find that within that?
I think so. I think we have to look more within, and I think we have to look more to community and find it in other ways.
Regarding what you're saying about young girls who are high achievers and they're suffering from anorexia.
Yes.
I was remembering, it's quite a long time ago, but when I worked in I did a placement in a children's home where I did social work training, and the boy had just started secondary school and he had been abused, so he was very vulnerable. And he came back day 3 or 4, I was starting at secondary school and saying, you know, they're trying to teach me Latin. I can't even speak English. And so on the one hand, one side you've got very deprived children or young people, and then on the other hand you've got these children you're talking about in the fee-paying schools who all these achievements, and the cost that is to them psychologically, physically perhaps as well, emotionally. But who's driving that? For me, there's, and I think of somebody in my own family who's a high achiever, whose son is 16, who's being pushed, to my mind, beyond his capabilities in a harmful way. I think I don't see how that can be good if you're continually being told that you need to do better, you need to work really hard, and there's no space to just be.
Yes.
Because there's this night it's that, the next night it's something else, and you've got all your homework, and if you don't do well in this, and the exams are all changing, I'm out of touch with all of that. And it troubles me because I see that even at the moment, but how are these people going to be as adults?
Yes.
And then, as you said, as mothers themselves, or fathers, or parents, whatever.
Yes. I agree, there's a lot of hot housing in that kind of way. And you do feel some of the times this is about the parents. That somehow the parents are justifying their existence through their children and their children's success. I think there's a balance to be struck. I was very aware of that as a parent. You want your child to develop their potential, you want them to have choices in life and so on. It's tricky, I think, for parents, but on the other hand, you don't want them, I feel one of my sons certainly could have done better at school. But ultimately, he went back to university and, ended up getting a first. He did do that, but he did it because he wanted to do it. He wasn't doing it for me.
He developed his potential.
Yeah, he did ultimately.
There was an actualising tendency that was allowed.
Yes, absolutely.
Rather than it be him being forced.
No, he wasn't forced to. No. With both my boys, they chose their course of action, and one of them is a gardener, so therefore, as happy as the day is long, a gardener at the Lost Gardens of Hilligan in Cornwall, and just loves it. Absolutely loves it. Paid terribly, I have to say, but loves it, and is likely to be happy for the rest of his life, because gardeners gardeners and hairdressers, I think, score very high on happiness for occupations. Hairdressers because it's a very social activity and it's a service and so on, and gardening because people usually get great satisfaction out of it.